Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, and with us once again is the great James Stevens Valliant. I almost said just Steven. I forget it's Stevens. It gets me confused.
A family name.
But,
It's an old family name.
but
Yeah.
James Stevens Valliant, Jim Valliant, we're here today to talk about the great economist Ludwig von Mises, continuing our discussions of the great libertarian thinkers, classical liberal thinkers, whatever you want to call them. However you put it, in my view, he was the greatest economist that ever lived. So I'm gonna turn it over to you and let us jump right into it. Where do you think we should begin with Ludwig von Mises?
Where to begin when it's such a vast subject and his achievement is so vast? He's one of my personal heroes because of the vast scope of his achievement, the courage that it took, the mental effort that it took. Talk about a hard-thinking, hard-working life. But F.A. Hayek, who saw him at his prime, working for the mind you, as an economic advisor for the Austrian government at one point. He saw him working in his own context, and he said he could accomplish in one day what it takes most of us to accomplish in just a couple of hours, what it would take most of us a week to accomplish. And when you think about the scope of his achievement, it had to be true. He had to be a monumental genius who had that kind of mental acuity and power, because the scope of his achievement, as I hope we can at least, and all we can really do is give an outline. He was born in what is today the Ukraine, to a well-to-do Jewish family that had achieved, rare for a Jewish family to achieve the kind of status that they'd achieved in the Austro-Hungarian Empire of the time. And his brother, they were given an outstanding education. His father worked for the railroads. His brother and he both received outstanding educations. Richard von Mises was part of the Vienna Circle and later taught mathematics at Harvard University. One of the he himself had a career as a mathematician that makes himself famous. Mises, his brother, as you say, went on to become, in my view, the greatest economist who ever lived. I take that knowing and appreciating the work of great economists like Adam Smith and Say and von Bauwerk and Menger and other people we're going to talk about, knowing all of their achievements, I still say Ludwig von Mises is not only maybe the greatest economist who ever lived, but maybe the greatest social scientist in a way who ever lived. And I say that, and I have profound disagreements philosophically with it, but even with all my disagreements, they don't, compared to his accomplishment, they don't amount to much at all. When it comes to integrating history, sociology, methodology, economics, one of the books, as a historian, one of the books that had the most influence on me, you probably can't read it here. It's a book called Theory and History. It's got mistakes in it. I don't fully agree with its philosophy, but there are certain moments here where an objectivist can't help but say, my goodness, this guy was on many of the same paths that Ayn Rand was. As a historian and as a historiographer, I was deeply influenced by his theory and history, his methodology of how to engage in being a social scientist. As such, and he criticized other views, whether it was the religious intrinsicist view of history or the materialist determinist view of history. He has a view of free will and individual agency in here that is critical to his understanding of history, that he believes refutes most of the BS social science arguments that you'll hear in universities. And it's a theory of free will and individual agency that is not Ayn Rand's. No, it is not. But it is closely related, and close enough that he has such profound insights into the entire topic of studying the social sciences that I can only recommend that people read Theory and History. You will learn. I learned. It
Great book.
shaped
Absolutely.
the way I approach the social sciences in a profound way. And now, of course, he was an economist. He got his doctorate in law, though, just like me. It's so funny that his birthday is my birthday, September 29th. But of course, it's like 80 years apart in a different country. And he has his degree, his doctorate in law. I have my doctorate in law. And so I feel many connections with him because he went way beyond. He was an economist, and he attended the seminars of the great economic critic of Karl Marx, a guy named Eugene von Bawerk. And his work, if you're interested in it, if you want to know why Karl Marx was a pseudoscientist when it comes to economics, why Karl Marx, one of the worst economists who ever lived, read von Bawerk's Karl Marx, The Close of His System. He also had a multi-volume work, Capital and Interest, where he expanded upon the theories of his own teacher, a guy named Karl Menger. Now, this guy, Karl Menger, the father of the Austrian school, was an amazing guy too. He had a theory of where money comes from, but more than that, he took what had been classical economics had sort of reached a dead end. It really had. It talked about things in big, gross, 30,000-foot elevation ways, like division of labor and big points. And I'm not going to take away from many of their achievements. David Ricardo was probably the most clear example of this, but he reached this dead end in effect. But consider his law of comparative advantage when it comes to free trade. It's a valid principle.
Sure.
But these principles are very abstract and they're very broad. What the Austrian school did with men like Karl Menger is they used what we would call methodological individualism. It started asking about the valuation of the individual players in the economy and how do those valuations have an impact and manifest across the economy. So called and it's really vague to call it this, the marginal utility revolution, in my view, turned the analysis of markets into a scientific matter. And now markets could be understood in an entirely different way using the concept of marginal utility. Well, these were his teachers, Ludwig von Mises at the University of Vienna. He attended the famous seminars of von Bawerk, who's the lead student of this guy Menger, and he further developed their work. And in 1911, he came out with a revolutionary work, The Theory of Money and Credit, in which he took the basic idea of the marginal utility revolution, which had been successfully applied now to the analysis of many, many markets. In economics today, you go to economics classes at university, they'll call it microeconomics. Well, no. What we mean by that is scientific economics, actually understanding something from a marginal utility perspective, which is really the only rational approach to understanding markets. Well, Ludwig von Mises, as a young man, who was only about 30, I don't think he was even 30 years old yet, when he wrote the theory and published The Theory of Money and Credit.
31.
31, okay, thank you for that. He was born in the 1880s, and this was 1911, I believe. In any case, The Theory of Money and Credit applied the marginal utility revolution to money itself. To money itself. And now a complete system of economics can be developed from the marginal insight, because now Mises could explain money itself and the business cycle itself, the boom bust cycle itself, as the product of monetary manipulation. First, understanding inflation as a monetary phenomenon, which inflation primarily should be understood as a monetary phenomenon,
Right.
and as the key to generating the business cycle. So this book, The Theory of Money and Credit, creates, in my view, a complete scientific economics for the first time.
Okay.
Nothing else.
So you said so much that I want to back up just a little bit. Okay. So
But
back to
just consider the revolution of those two books in the fields of economics and social sciences generally.
I want to back up first to Menger. And
Okay.
Menger's
Name a lot of people there.
yeah, Menger's Principles of Economics came out, I believe, I want to say in 1877. I might be off by a year or two, but I believe it was 1871. At the same time, Leon Walras and William Stanley Jevons, but all of them discover, they say simultaneously. Obviously, it's not all at the same exact moment, but at the same time, in the
There's
same
slightly
time frame.
different angles on it, and they're
Yeah.
definitely putting it in different ways.
Yes.
But like evolution was discovered by both Darwin and Wallace independently, or calculus was discovered by Newton and
Right.
Leibniz independently. So it was that the basic idea of the marginal utility was discovered by at least three different
Right.
people at about the same time in the 1870s and 80s.
Right.
You're right.
And without getting into too much detail, basically it solves the diamond water paradox. Right.
Right.
A question that befuddled
Yes.
economists was,
Intrinsic value.
why is it that water, which everybody needs, is basically, useless? It's cheap. I mean, not useless, it's
As
cheap.
cheap as
Whereas
water.
diamonds, which nobody needs, are through the roof. And the marginal utility demonstrates it's because of the amount of water it's in the amount of diamonds
If I was in the Sahara Desert, I
then you'd be
pay
needing water.
I might
Absolutely.
pay a pretty penny for just a cup of
Right.
water if I'm in the
Right.
middle of this area. It's a
Right.
question of valuer and context.
Yes. Yes. Because
And that's what marginal utility is taking
yes.
into account, valuer and context.
Yes.
That's why I call it methodological individualism.
Right. And what Mises does, and we can get into the subjective value stuff, but he talks about economics as not the study of goods and services, but of purposeful human action. That it's all about human behavior, because it's like you said, it's about in a valuer, somebody that's assessing different goods, different services, whatever, and deciding how to act.
Right.
So from Menger, we get the marginal utility stuff.
And he was one of the very first, and he put it probably the best of these guys in the 1870s.
I thought he was great.
Yeah.
And it's Grundsatz. I don't know how to pronounce it. Principles of Economics. There's a German word
Principles
for
of
it, though.
Economics is the name of his great book from the
Right.
1870s. And he was influenced by Aristotle directly. And that's why you can see this methodological individualism and why Carl Menger was so articulate, in my view. It's his Aristotelianism that made Carl Menger such a articulate presenter of the theory. And he was one of the very first.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we move on to von Bauer. Now, the two things that I think are important for the discussion we're having here is, one, he demonstrates that Marx is wrong, whereas where
Oh,
Marx where
wrong.
Marx thinks Marx is talking about profit. Von Bauer shows that what he's actually talking about is interest, which is a natural phenomenon, because some people are willing to save and some people want things now. So if
Right.
you want things now, you're not putting off. And so you end up with interest. So in the case of a laborer and an entrepreneur, the entrepreneur foregoes immediate satisfaction, whereas
Now,
the laborer gets it
right,
right away. So
right.
you end up getting money. So
And it's a trade-off based on time, which is
right.
pregnant to what Mises is
And that's the next thing I want to talk
right.
about von
Yes.
Bauer is his interest theory, which Mises disagreed with on some aspects, but is a time preference. That time preference is everybody has it, but some people have it more than others, and that's what gives, it
And
ultimately
there
gives
should
rise
be
to
a
the concept of
demand.
interest.
There should be we should be able to recognize the relative differences in demand for time preference. I mean, like any other price, if I need, medicine, if I need gasoline more than someone for real reasons, I should be able to outbid them on the market.
Right,
Similarly, this is similarly true for money and credit itself.
right,
The classical economists and the Marxists were so wrong about something fundamental, the labor theory of value.
right,
They thought of that value was intrinsic to labor. But if you think about it, if I whittle something with my own little knife and it takes me 10 years to whittle the same thing that could have been made by a machine in 10 minutes, is the years of labor that I put in it going to make the value of the thing really different to another
no,
value?
no,
No,
it's
it is not.
irrelevant.
It's irrelevant.
Yeah,
Once
if
you
I
take
were,
into account the things that we just mentioned, individual valuation and wider context, suddenly the labor theory of value becomes absurd on the face of it.
right,
And so
whether
someone like von
creating
Bauer
Christ,
can come along with a battering ram and destroy every economic premise that Marx had. And if you, like I say, friends, if you want to see why Marx is such a lousy economist, dip your toe into von Bauer. He will
right,
hit your head. He will devastate, but he'll simultaneously devastate some of the premises of classically, especially the late classical economists who shared this exact view of labor with the Marxists.
well, that's where Marx ultimately gets to develop his theory of exploitation, because if labor determines the value of products, then why are these greedy capitalists getting anything when they're not
It
the
must
ones
be
putting them?
exploitation.
It has to be, right. But in reality, it doesn't matter how long Jim Valliant works on creating Christ or how much effort he puts into it. If it's a crappy book and
It's a
nobody
crap.
wants to read it, it's irrelevant, right?
Its value to someone else, my reader, is not determined by how much labor I put into it. I can assure you.
So
I could
von
I
Mises,
could dig holes. Well, I had as an undergraduate, one of my economics professors was Israel Kirzner, who was a student of Ludwig von Mises. And the example he used is, every day I could go to my backyard, dig a hole, fill it up every night, dig the hole back up, fill it up every night. There's a lot of labor, and I could do this for days and days and days. Have I created anything that anyone will ever
no.
value? No. But he said it's not even the uselessness of it. It's the fact that there's someone out there who won't value it. This was the marginal revolution.
Now, I want to, before we can get, there's three books basically I want to discuss a little bit. I
Yeah.
want to do Theory of Money and Credit, Socialism, and the Human Action. But we've mentioned this sort of value or subjective value. And I think that this is an important distinction because Mises taught that all value is subjective, whereas Ayn Rand taught that values are objective. And I, of course, side with Rand, but I think where Mises makes the mistake is between what people value and what actually has value. Because on a market, it doesn't matter what is objectively valuable because people can be mistaken. It matters what people value,
In
what
Ayn,
they attach importance to.
in Ayn Rand's book, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, she actually makes a distinction between what she means by objective value and socially objective value, which is what market prices reflect. She has a discussion, for example, why should Elvis Presley be paid more than Albert Einstein? And so you think about, well, the objective value of Albert Einstein's work in the long run may be much greater for humanity as a whole. 100 years from now, we'll say, well, geez, look at all that Einstein gave us versus, well, Elvis Presley gave us some musical performances. And so people say, well, isn't there something wrong in a world in which Elvis Presley gets paid more? Ayn Rand said, what we would call as objective value is not being reflected in
Yeah,
prices. A socially objective. What do more people,
value.
more individuals getting out value out of now
Right.
from a book by Albert Einstein or a concert from Elvis Presley? Well, guess what? When it comes to, let me put it this way, it's so funny that this is an argument made by our egalitarian friends, because really what we're saying is that the market is catering democratically. One of the great arguments Mises makes is that every dollar spent is like a vote.
Yeah, he says that the market is the purest democracy you're
The
ever going to
purest of
see.
democracies,
Yeah.
liberalism in action, because the only way we can really be democratic in the very sense you're talking about here, Elvis Presley, why should someone who will never appreciate the mathematics and science and theories of Albert Einstein pay for it? No, Elvis Presley was giving more of an immediate value to more people. So, of course, he's going to get richer and should. But that reflects, in effect, democratic values, right? The things that people happen to value. And I could say, and look, when it comes to something like Elvis Presley, I'm not going to make an argument, but say someone is buying the books of Karl Marx over Bombardiers, that's a subjective preference on their part.
Yes.
I mean, they may be wrong. I would objectively say, no, the Bombardiers books are objectively superior as science to Karl Marx's books as science. And I would be right. The objective value of Bob Bawerk is superior to that of Marx. Eat whatever the market says.
So
Even if our professors make their students buy, capital than buy a capital and interest.
So we have with the publication of the Theory of Money and Credit, and it's the important thing is that when Mises and the older economists use the term inflation, they're talking about an increase in the money supply beyond what's necessary for the exchanges in the economy. They're not talking about price inflation. They're talking about inflation in the money supply. Price inflation happens to be one consequence of that.
And this is the thing we have to understand. that the term inflation should, all of the things being equal, you just use the word inflation out of context. We should simply mean monetary inflation.
Right.
That's what it's all about, because that's really the thing that's important here. But when we're talking about price inflation, there are a number of factors that can go into any, and well, that's part of the insight of the Austrians. There are any number of given factors that can go into a particular price at any given particular time, because the pricing system itself is a giant coordination of things. And government intervention with one little area here can distort too. So, but you're absolutely right. Yeah.
So in the theory of money and credit, he puts forth the basis, right, of his trade cycle theory,
Trade cycle theory.
which I'm gonna state it, and I want you to elaborate. It's based on, like we said, time preference. So if the government throws money into the economy, the banks get the money. Now the banks have to loan money out. In order for the banks to get rid of the excess money, they have to drop the interest rate. Now, entrepreneurs who are looking, and capitalists looking to invest, see a low interest rate. When they see it, they assume that reflects a high time preference. They assume savings. So they assume there's no demand for present goods, but there will be a demand for goods in the future, and
Must
they
be a
direct investment
backup
toward
saving.
that.
And critically, as you
Yes,
point out, they're assuming that this implies a bunch of backed up savings available
right. But
for
that's not
investment,
really there.
which
So
is,
so they invest in things that aren't actually in demand. Basically, the coordinative mechanisms of the market are distorted, and
most
that
people
leads to
see
the
this
crash.
as over investment.
No,
Mises says
malinvestment.
it correctly. It's
Yes.
malinvestment. It's bad investments that'll have to be liquidated at a later time. The common sense way of thinking about it, overproduction creates a depression. It's over, no, 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 no. It's it's malinvestment, it's bad investments, misjudged investments, in effect. Mises is correct about that. Yeah.
So what was the impact? Do you know of this book of the theory of money and
Well,
credit?
at first it was only in German. And so, if you were an Austrian or a German, I'm sure you learned a great deal from it. But it was not until F.A. Hayek, one of the great students of Ludwig von Mises, actually started teaching at the London School of Economics in the 1930s. One of the founders of the London School of Economics, Lord Lionel Robbins, he was one of the people responsible for the first English language translations and editions of Theory of Money and Credit. But I think that didn't happen until 1934. Hayek started working at London School of Economics in 33, and Lord Robbins wrote the introduction to the first English language edition of Theory of Money and Credit in 1934, I believe. Wow, how do I keep these details in my head? I don't know. But it wasn't until the point is that it wasn't until the 1930s that Theory of Money and Credit was even translated into English, which was just a practical problem there. Now, it was coming in through other people. There were some other scholars who could read German, and the ideas were trickling in various ways through other economists in the English-speaking world, but indirectly and in little teeny bits and minutely. It really didn't hit the scene of economics until the 1930s. And frankly, the ideas of Mises generally didn't hit the English-speaking world until a journalist, the chief economics writer for the New York Times from the mid 1930s to the mid 1940s was a guy named Henry Hazlitt. And he did more to promote and advance and explain the ideas of Ludwig von Mises to the English-speaking world than anyone else did.
Yeah. Yeah, we've got a whole episode of Hazlitt coming up, I'm
The
sure.
great Henry Hazlitt.
Yeah.
But even before Henry Hazlitt met Mises personally, he read some of his works. He reviewed for the New York Times Socialism when it was first translated into English. He called it a classic in our times. It's as if Adam Smith is alive in our age, and this is it. He agrees with you then and there. When socialism was translated into English, Henry Hazlitt declared it to be a classic, and Mises to be the greatest economist of all time.
Well,
Wow.
with socialism, the thing I find amazing about the book Socialism is one often hears socialism works in theory, but not in practice. But in the book Socialism, which is highly theoretical, Mises destroys it. He demonstrates that socialism simply is impossible in real life, can't work. And
It's
and and now
connected to all these things that we were saying.
right.
Consider the price system. Just one example.
Yes,
You know,
you explain it. This how
well,
subjective values, the price system.
see,
Go
now
ahead.
think about it. if, and this is the thing, a news story will happen, and I always crack up when a news story happens. There's some disruption in the supply of some product, and the price goes up, and immediately the cry is, oh, price gouging. It's a terrible thing that the price is going up. And I'm thinking to myself, no, get your hands off it and let the price go up. Why? Why? Because if we don't allow the price of a commodity that is becoming more rare to go up, then two things are happening. The consumer doesn't know that it's more, so he's not cutting back on even his marginal consumption, even that little extra whatever use he might have put to it. He's not cutting back at all. If the price is artificially low, he's still buying just as much as ever. The producer, he's not gaining any additional profits from selling more, so he's not making any more. What motive does he have to make more? And where does he have the resources, the capital, to invest in it anyway? So when we allow the price of something to go up, say like oil, what we're doing is we're sending two signals, information. Hold that thought. Two important signals are being sent. One to a consumer, cut back on your marginal consumption of that good. Geez, it's getting more expensive, so I'm not going to, use as much of that. Right. The producer now is now being told, aha, there's something in the market now, either much greater demand or much lower supply, so you better get the hell in and make more of it. So it encourages the producer, by having these greater profits, to rush in and produce more. More than that, it'll start giving him the capital with the higher profits in order to invest in it and to make more of that thing. So without the free market pricing system, critical information is not being delivered to the market. And when you think about an entire economy, what we're talking about is the coordination of thousands and thousands of goods. So take, for example, the demand for leather. Now, leather has multiple uses. Leather can be used to make shoes. Leather can be used to make, things in automobiles. Leather can be used to make belts. Now, how on earth does an economy coordinate the relative demand for belts, purses, leather in automobiles, etc., leather for couches? How on earth does that all get coordinated? Well, it is the free market pricing system. And every day, every single one of these supplies and demands are in constant coordination with demand with one each other. So every time I go, look, and people get the wrong idea. I think one of the reasons why people get the wrong idea is when I walk into Walmart and buy a television, I don't negotiate the price. I either buy it at the price they offer or they don't. So does Walmart get to set whatever the hell price they want?
No.
No. In fact, Walmart is under some very narrow constraints about where to set that price to maximize its profit. And it is the marginal consumer, is that consumer who says, well, no, I'm not going to buy it at that price. Or no, I will buy it at that price. It is that marginal consumer who's making the decision for Walmart. Walmart is in effect not a slave to me as I walk in, but they are a slave to an even smaller group, a small minority of people at the margin who are sort of dictating the price. Okay, now that we understand a little bit about what prices do, consider the interest rate and time preference. What you just said there, the actual demand for capital is not reflected when the government is manipulating the money supply. The actual demand for credit is not correctly being reflected. You just pointed out how the bank is not in effect being affected by the real demand or the real supply of gold or the demand for credit. Those aren't the factors that are going into the interest rate. So discoordination must happen. Mises' essential critique of socialism is just that. To the extent you try and control the economy, you're actually losing control. Why? Because you're diminishing the amount of information that the players in the economy have. The less the information, the more chaotic, the more discoordinated it must be. He made some astonishing predictions about the nature of a wholesale socialist economy. The Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, had just happened a couple years earlier in October of 1917. Only about 2 years later, he's coming out with socialism. And he's making predictions about the coordination of products and related products. So let me give you a hatched example. Sure, the commissar could come out to the balcony and say, oh yeah, we need more eggs. Look, chicken producers, make more eggs. Well, but how do we get the eggs to the market? No one noticed that the cardboard containers that brought the eggs to market were needed. And so you've got a bunch of eggs rotting over at the egg farms now and not even getting to market. Those were the sort of discoordinations that Mises could predict and see happening. And he said, that's what will happen. And the more you attempt to grab, it's like sand in your hands. The tighter your grip, the more sand slips out. And is a brilliant analogy. So one little summary of the summary pamphlet he basically wrote of his theory in socialism is called planned chaos. The more you try to coerce and plan an economy, the more chaos, the more discoordinated it will be. And so what he's saying is there's a bad theory because it can't work in practice. The more you try to control, the less control you're actually going to have. Control totally slips away. And you'll notice the other thing that happened. The Soviets still needed some way to set their prices. So what would they do? They would look to Western economies
Right.
and Western markets in most cases to help do their maxi-min formulas when they would set their prices in the Russian bloc. Mises perfectly predicted the economic chaos that socialism in the 20th century would be. And it happened. It happened.
Yeah.
It happened just as he said it would happen.
Yeah. He predicted both the Great Depression and the fall of the Soviet Union.
Both, and it was astonishing. I mean, really, the man was a dynamo because he understood. He understood things at such a fundamental level. Yeah, and look, with the guy who comes up with the theory of money and credit, and the guy who comes up with socialism is going to be a pretty principled free market guy. He understands the importance of freedom for the development of a rational economic, a coordinated, and efficient, right? He sees the connection between the productivity, the core, in fact, he sees something which is astonishing in some of his other works. He'll see that the consumer satisfaction is intimately connected. Now think about it, because if you're not looking at it from this standpoint of marginal utility, the individual actor and his values, the individual is going to be less satisfied necessarily. The socialist planner who says, oh no, I know what people want and I can give them what they want, is in effect saying that this one guy, knows better than each of a million different people what they want. Now, how are you going to coordinate the subjective desires of a million different people? I don't care what computer you have. I don't care what group of experts you have. It has to be a product of the voluntary choices of the actual players, the individual players in the economy. And this is what I mean when I say methodological individualism. Menger and Mises in the field of economics made it scientific by making it methodologically individualistic. Does that make sense?
It does to me. So, I mean, Mises, he said something to the extent of, even if you had 1,000 people screaming in unison, it would still be a group of individuals. And one of the things that he said that I like is that from his perspective, and he tries to keep things as value free as possible, right? It's pure science. So what he does is he says, look, I'm not going to tell you what you should want. What I'm going to show you is that from the point of view of the socialists, of the big government people, of the interferers in the market, that the things that they're advocating cannot produce the results that they want.
Be less satisfied qua consumer, promise.
Right. So the next, I don't know about if it was the next, but the next one I want to talk about, his magnum opus, Human Action. I believe 1949, I want to say it came out.
Right. Oh, and the first edition from Yale University Press was mangled.
I heard, yes.
But and he found a better publisher and they did a better job of it. But that is his magnum opus, and it coordinates really all of his thinking. In between, he'd done all kinds of, like you say, he'd done a work on omnipotent government, written during
Omnipotent Government. Yeah, great book. Also
during World War II. A really powerful history and critique of Nazism. I highly recommend. Socialism, liberalism, where he shows that the liberal values of peace and freedom and civil rights and the belief in the dignity of man. See, he can talk all he wants, and we will talk about his errors when we get into Human Action in a second, because he does insist on value neutrality. being a scientific thing. And that is one of his problems. For example, he'll say that on a desert island, you wouldn't need morality. Morality is purely social. And okay, so as an objectivist, we will have differences with Ludwig von Mises. We know you need morality on a desert island. It's not just social. And we know that value can be objective. And he doesn't even want to enter into
Yeah.
that discussion.
But Ayn
So
Rand gave him a pass, so I think I can too.
exactly.
I think I
Ayn
can
Rand
give him
gave
a
him a
pass.
pass. And more than that, but I'll go further. I'll say that in a book like Liberalism, you can actually see him passionately advocating for individual freedom, for classical liberalism, for world peace. He understood and argued there that the only option to war is trade. Trade. He shows that how international trade is the greatest bulwark against war. He shows there how civil liberties and economic liberties really work hand in hand, how democracy really has to go with the free market if you believe in democracy. In his book Liberalism, it's so passionate. It's so his book Bureaucracy. I was going to quote, forget that. In his book Bureaucracy, I urge you to read it. It's a passionate defense, in effect, of the value of human liberty. So, and individual liberty. So while he is value free and will insist on that, I submit that his values are there, passionate, and come through loud and clear in certain
He
works.
can't hide them. They're
He
so
can't hide
strong.
them. He can't hide them. Not in liberalism, not in bureaucracy, not in omnipotent government, where he's complaining about the Nazis. And this is another biographical fact people have to understand. As a Jew, he could not, even though he was the greatest economist working, and it was recognized at the time that he was the greatest economist working on the continent of Europe in the 1920s, he could not get a job as a professor of economics, but as a private docent. He had to work as an advisor to the Austrian government. When it looked like Hitler was taking power in Germany in 1933, he left Austria. As both a liberal and a supporter of the previous government and a Jew, he would have been toast when the Anschluss happened and Hitler came into Austria. So in 1933, when Hitler was coming to power, he hightailed it to Switzerland and he taught there. And there he was actually teaching economics for several years until he was brought to America. And it was the Volcker Fund who funded him. And it was this journalist, Henry Hazlitt, who got him a job teaching economics at NYU in the late 1930s. That may well have saved his move to Switzerland. That probably saved his life. But his move to America not only ensured his safety, but it brought the master Austrian economist to the English-speaking world. And even more than Henry Hazlitt's introduction, say in the 30s, the presence of Mises here in America. And from the 1950s through the 1970s, I think when he retired, he was the oldest teaching professor in America at the time when he was doing his economics seminars at NYU. He died in 1973, the year before his great European student, Hayek, won the Nobel Prize in economics for developing Mises's theory. Now, with all that said, human action.
Human action. So in human action, he gets into all the stuff. He elaborates on his trade cycle theory. He talks about methodological individualism, subjective values in the economy. He critiques all types of market interventions, minimum wage, tariffs, price controls, all that. All that's wonderfully does that great. But what I want to focus on is, because I think it's where you and I are going to disagree with him, but to a different extent, I believe. And that's on his methodology, because what he taught was that economics is not an empirical science. He said that economics is an a priori, it's based on a priori deductions. And I'm going to try to explain this the best I can. Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, taught that human beings cannot gain knowledge of the actual world. That the world is divided into the noumena and the phenomena, and that we can't know the noumena. That's the real world. What we have access to is the phenomenal world, which just means the world of experience. And he had these categories of the human mind that processed all the information. I don't remember all of them, but time, cause and effect, space. There was a whole lot of these things.
Causality, logic.
Causality, logic, yeah. So Mises teaches that the category of human action, which means basically the concept, but he believes they're a priori concepts, that all you have to do is deduce the economic laws from this concept with the help, though, of constructions that you would have to think through, like an evenly rotating economy, for instance, or you could imagine different scenarios taking place, but because we know from the a priori concept of human action, we can therefore deduce all the laws of economic science. Go. I don't know what else to say. Go. If I'm wrong on any of that, Jim, by the way,
No, you're
correct
right.
me.
No,
Okay,
you're
so
right. He's an advocate of a priorism. And what that means, a priori versus a posteriori, in philosophy means before or after experience. So do we need sense experience to know it? If so, it's a posteriori. If it's something that we can know by definition, tautologically, then we know it a priori. Or, and this is how Mises sometimes uses a priori, it's a self-evident axiom. So, for example, I mentioned, this is a great example, what I mentioned earlier, free will. When he discusses free will, he will say, I can't prove free will to the mechanist. I believe in it because, but the mechanist is ignoring the power. Now get the connection with Ayn Rand. His mechanist is ignoring the power of ideas and human creativity from the inside. Oh, yes, that's exactly it. You're on the right track. You got the right whiff there, Professor von Mises. But then he says, but free will cannot be proven empirically. Cannot be proven empirically. It is an a priori assumption of my social thinking. Now think about that for a second. There can be something that is non-empirical. That is what makes it an effect a priori by definition. So if you're going to defend a priorism in what Rothbart did with one of the great American students was the guy we spoke about, who spoke about a couple of weeks ago, Murray Rothbard. His form of a priorism is a little different. Murray Rothbard jumps away from what philosophy, the terminology, as philosophers use it. It's not prior to or posterior to experience at all. Rothbard says, no, my a priori assumptions are basic empirical, but they're self-evident.
right.
Like with free will is a great example.
Yeah.
Rothbard, who learns his theory of free will from Ayn Rand, says, aha, no, it is observationally self-evident. So what I call a priori is observational, empirical, but which contradicts what a priori means, prior to experience. A priori, prior to what?
What he
Experience.
means is it's the fact that humans act is
So
self-evident.
he should use other language.
Sure. But I'll tell you this, Jim, Rothbard ultimately helped me escape from, Rothbard helped me bridge the gap between
That's true.
Mises and Ayn Rand. That's
And I
the
can
role
see,
Rothbard did
and I
for
can
me.
certainly see how he can do that. But you can see Rothbard, in order to rescue Mises's terminology, sort of redefines it. Mises is using a priori in its classical philosophic sense, prior to experience. And so when he says humans have free will in human action or in theory and history, he will say flat out, I can't prove this empirically. Therefore, it's a priori. But it's an assumption you have to make. I can't make sense of the world unless I believe in this a priori assumption, says Mises. We all know it. So he's going to say it's self-evident in one sense, but he's not going to say it's empirical. So strictly speaking, he's using a priori in its correct philosophical sense, the way philosophers have used it since even before Kant.
Right.
But in the case of Rothbard, he Aristotelianizes it. Now, Aristotle was a little different than Kant. Aristotle said, begins with observation. We see correlations by observation and generalization, and we build up those generalized correlations, not causes, until we get to the axiom, the most fundamental correlation. And when that axiom is self-evident to me, then I turn around and can deduce with certainty the things that had before merely been correlations. So, and now let's contrast Ayn Rand with all of these. Ayn Rand says, no, at each step up initially, it's valid induction. She believes in the validity of induction because she had a solid response to the theory of universals. So she has valid induction. And she says it's only as valid as each step of the induction takes you up the chain. So that's the real difference between her approach and Aristotle's. I would say Rothbard is sort of a transition between Mises's admitted Kantian a priorist fallacies and Aristotle. So that Rothbard is much more like Aristotle. Rothbard will say, initially, I'm getting my generalizations from observation, but then once it becomes an axiom, that's when we can have certainty, deduce the science of economics from its axioms, which themselves have been generated empirically. So I would say that Rothbard was an Aristotelian who slightly modified the use of the term a priori. By that, he meant posterior to experience, but still based on a basic axiom that could not be refuted. And once it was understood as a self-evident axiom, we can now confidently deduce from that. Ayn Rand would have disagreed with both of them, Aristotle and Rothbard. You see, she says, no, no, no. Each step of the induction has to be valid on the way up. Then you get to the axioms. Well, then, of course, now. And then to her, it's yawn. The deduction part isn't validating anything. For Rothbard and Aristotle, the ability to deduce back from axioms is the demonstration of certainty. No, no, no. For Ayn Rand, it's the validity of the concepts as you were building it up, the general inductive generalizations as you were building it up to your big principle, and then you deduce. Well, yeah, once you that is her, now you're you're coasting downhill from there as far as Ayn Rand is concerned. It's sheer deduction, but there's something to that in the social sciences. For example, we were talking about the complexity of markets. I can't tell you about the price of oil out of context because it depends upon what will the price of a gallon of oil be March of next year. Can I tell you that? No, it is not exactly predictive economics as a science. Does that make it non-objective? No. What I'm admitting is that there is a bunch of factors that I can't control for. If I could simply tell you all of this is the magic phrase that we keep using, all other things being equal, if I could tell you all other things are going to be equal, but this one factor, why then I could tell you what there'll be a tendency to have it go this way, and it will go this way. But that's unfortunately not the way reality presents itself. There's all kinds of other intermediate. What if suddenly the demand for oil drops out? China no longer needs to, and suddenly there's some, and I'm making this up out of thin air. Suddenly there's some reason why the demand of oil gets disrupted in some part of the world. Oh, well, now I have to change my calculations altogether, don't I? Because you can't hold everything equal. And so the attractiveness of an a priorist approach is that we can hold factors equal, and we can consider each of the principles separately and consider them conceptually in sort of a mind experiment.
Yes,
And
mental experiments.
That's really the way economics, and this we totally agree with. The way we have to do it is infer from reality, and let's face it, something like free will is an observable truth. Infer from reality based on the observed facts, and the more basic the fact, the more important it's going to be in any field of the humanities or social sciences. And we can infer things from that, but then we still have to constantly be looking back over our shoulder at reality to make sure it's true. So, for example, let me give you an example. In the 1970s, because of just like today, there was an Israeli-Arab conflict. And because of the Israeli-Arab conflict, OPEC decided to cut back on the production of oil. Now, because of American inflation, Richard Nixon had imposed wage and price controls. And even after he lifted most of them, because they were a disaster immediately, he had to lift most of them almost immediately, because, of course, as Mises could have told him, it would have been a total disaster. And they were a total disaster, and it really were counterproductive to the fight against inflation, too. In any event, there were many reasons why it was a bust, and he lifted most of them, except on the consumer price of petroleum. And so throughout the 1970s, as OPEC was cutting back on supply of international oil, America had had this price lid on the consumer price of petroleum. Now, what do you suppose resulted? Shortages and gas lines. And
Yeah.
I can remember a time when you take turns based on your license plate, even or odd number at the end of your license plate would determine what day you could buy oil.
Yeah.
So they had rationing and all kinds of other irrationalities. Ronald Reagan comes in, and within the first week he's president, he signs an executive order lifting the regulation on the consumer price of oil. 2 years later, there's an international glut of the supply of oil. Now, I know that there's all kinds of other factors that were playing in. But if that, let's say that had no effect, the lifting of the regulation of the price of oil, say even on shortages and gas lines, then I would have myself had to pause and think, what other factor am I leaving out? That I missed this, that is obscuring what should obviously have been what happened. But what happened happened. Similarly, when the 2008 bubble happened, the financial bubble, and before that, the dot-com bubble in 2001. I mean, these bubbles are things that people could see coming a mile off, which was always the astonishing thing to me too. It wasn't any big surprise. People understood that the government subsidizing, for example, of mortgages was leading to this giant real estate bubble. Or before that, that the way people, the dot-com bubble was a little different, wasn't it? And in fact, the way those two are even discussed, well, I remember even at the time, you people aren't even thinking like an economist, are you? They're not. And they absolutely weren't. But say when the 2008 crash, which was going to be my example, happened, and George Bush comes out, what does he say? I'm going to bail out Wall Street because I'm not a, quote, Ayn Rand Republican. That was an exact quote from the President of the United States in 2008 as he's walking out the door and he's bailing out these big Wall Street firms. Okay. At the time, obviously, what he's doing is creating all kinds of moral hazard. How many different directions? He's rewarding them for their poor economic decisions. In a free market, that means we have to let businesses go out and go under too. A free market does not mean Republicans subsidizing big business or bailing out Wall Street in 2008. And this is another thing that Mises understood very, very well. You have to let the malinvestment get liquidated, and you have to be quick and merciless about it. In fact, that's the merciful way of going about it, is to tear that Band-Aid off just as quickly as possible, is the best way, Mises would say. So don't bail out Wall Street. I could almost predict Mises saying, being angry at the Republicans for bailing out Wall Street. And what does that do? It creates in the minds of people, Republicans aren't for me, and they're not for the economy. They're for rich fat cats on Wall Street, which is exactly the way it then appears to the world. And Republicans get all the bad reputation they deserve, because when it comes to capitalism, they're bailing out people who made poor economic decisions, who should have gone under, and created this issue so that now we no longer have, or at least put in the mind of these these investment bankers, right? These folks on Wall Street and stuff, the idea that no, there's not a bailout here. You can't avoid the moral hazard. Careful when you make that loan. Careful when you make that investment, because you're going to pay the price. And we should have made them pay the price, even though the government was behind it all. I don't know. But there were those are two cases, the real estate boom and the oil price thing, where I could really empirically see with great clarity, because it was as though an experiment had happened.
Only because you know the theory, though. This is
right.
where I think, because this is where Mises, I believe, is correct.
Well, and I admit that. It's
because
only
there's so many other things going around. Yeah, there's so many other factors.
And it's only because I already had the concepts. Right. I absolutely agree. But how did those concepts get developed except through enough experiences like that?
Sure. And that's where you and I agree. And then through the use of mental experiments, you can see, okay, these factors are irrelevant.
Take this: East and West Germany during the Cold War, or North and South Korea today.
Yes. Those are the closest to real world experiments.
Or how about little teeny resource free until the communists took it over, at least.
Hong
Kong. Resource free Hong Kong's success versus, say, most of the continents of Asia and Africa, South America, loaded with natural resources, mired and wallowing in stagnation. Compare these certain little economies that have been a relatively free market versus all these natural resource economies that have been controlled by dictators, juntas, and fascists and communists, right? Obviously, wealth is not a function of natural resources. Obviously not. All the natural resources of North America were not used by the
Native Americans.
The Industrial Revolution happened here too. So, yeah.
Okay. So
We do have, in other words, we do have empirical evidence, which must be the original generators of the principles, or at least the way we can test the principles against all other things being equal. And there are cases of clarity in this. For example, I don't agree, for example, with Milton, as we've discussed, Milton Friedman's strict his theory of monetary inflation believes that there's actually a mathematical correlation, a proportionate to correlation that you could derive of increases in money supply to price inflation. Austrians totally disagree because they're aware of the complexity of the various factors involved.
Right.
So I disagree with him. On the other hand, we were having a discussion about Rothbart and America's Great Depression, and we say, well, he was wrong about the money supply during the Great Depression. Well, right. And I agree with you. I accept that. Where do I go? I go look at Milton Friedman and Hannah Schwartz's Monetary History of the United States, which is also somewhere around here.
Riveting read too, right?
Riveting read.
Very real page turner.
Real page. Well, but the truth is, it'll give you at least the facts about.
No, I recommend it to anybody interested in.
And is there not?
Sure.
And is there not, as Professor Friedman said, a correlation between the money supply and the general price level?
Sure.
Sure.
It's just not the helicopter effect.
It's just not the helicopter. Exactly. But it was that generalization, that empirical generalization, that allowed me to come up with the principle in the first place.
So Ludwig von Mises, he develops the theory that predicts the Great Depression.
Yes.
His theory of how markets work predict the demise of socialism and communism. He shows how all types of market interventions fail, from price controls to tariffs to taxes to minimum wage. Despite his errors, this guy is an intellectual giant in the pursuit of liberty. He absolutely was phenomenal on a historical scale in promoting the type of things that you and Ayn Rand also, because she recommended his books, believed in.
Highly.
And before we close out,
and people don't realize this, but Ayn Rand was friendly with Henry Hazlitt even before her success with the Fountainhead. She was friendly with Henry Hazlitt and his wife, personal friends of theirs, before she became world famous. And she was a follower of the journalism of Hazlitt. Hazlitt's journalism had plugged her into Mises. And when she got to know Mises or Hazlitt, Hazlitt was hell-bent on introducing these two people. He knew that they should be introduced, and it was Hazlitt who personally introduced Mises to Ayn Rand.
And Mises never actually called her an ignorant Jewish girl, just for the record.
A BS myth story made up by Ayn
William F. Buckley.
I have read the letter. Henry Hazlitt was supposed to have been there at their meeting because he introduced them. I've read the letter he wrote to Russell Kirk saying, "No such BS happened, sir. Please stop spreading this lie."
It was William F. Buckley, Jim, wasn't it?
William Buckley got it from Russell Kirk.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh,
all right.
The letter you can read at the Ayn Rand archives. They have the letter that Henry Hazlitt wrote to Russell Kirk.
Yeah, I've read the letter. I thought it was to William F. Buckley, but I could be wrong.
I think it's to Russell Kirk, where Buckley got the idea.
But either way, it's a BS story.
BS story.
Okay, before we close out on this great man who's a hero of both of ours and whose faults we're more than willing to overlook, I want to address the fact that there's a faction right now in the Libertarian Party that has taken this great man's name in the promotion of things that he never would have supported, such as, for instance, anarchy, secession down to the individual, I should say, because that's what they believe in.
Individual sovereignty.
And immigration. I just want to get
anti-immigrant. They want, and think of it, they have economic and cultural arguments that would have been offensive to Mises.
Yeah, and they could nitpick and say, well, that's not, immigration is not in our platform. Look, I really don't care. You've endorsed a candidate for president in Michael Rechtenwald, a guy who is for immigration restrictions. He's an anarchist. He's a Hoppian Rothbardian, and also used to be a Marxist. But whatever. But the bottom line is, they ought to call themselves the Rothbard Hoppe Caucus and not the Mises Caucus,
because
it's fundamentally dishonest
It's
to
Hoppe
take the
and
name of
Rothbart they're
Mises.
following, not Mises. And
Right.
calling their organization Mises is deceptive. People like you and me who love Mises and honor him know he was not an anarchist, know he wouldn't have been for all this crap, know that the kind of the arguments that the nativist, conservative type arguments
Right.
people like Lou Rockwell make, they're conservatives down to their bones. They're not, they're not classical liberals. I bring up Mises's book Liberalism just for that point. Mises is spinning in his grave. It is disgusting what they're doing, what the Mises caucus is doing to the reputation of a great man who was no anarchist and who would have Rechtenwald's arguments about immigration.
Oh, he would have destroyed him.
He would have destroyed them. And I would add both the economic and cultural ones. Those are not valid reasons to restrict immigration. They're counterproductive economically and culturally regressive.
Yes.
Mises would have said both of those things right to the man's face. Though, if anyone says you should restrict immigration because of economic reasons, or restrict immigrate because it takes jobs away or something, it's bad for our economy in some way, or that it's destroying our culture, you know those people are anti-liberal. They don't understand economics, and they are socially regressive in their thinking. The greatest thing America has experienced are the wave after wave of culture that has hit us. And I am a descendant of, I'm an Anglo, okay? My ancestors have been here since the 16 and 1700s. So I'm your classic waspy American, okay? I love Japanese food, Chinese food, Italian food. And I know that America has corrupted those things. I know that we've transformed those things. But I think of all the different cultures that have been absorbed and that when I was a little boy, two of my friends, one was a Vietnamese immigrant, one was a Mexican immigrant. They taught me so much about the world, about different way people lived, their diets, the way they, no, 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 no. One of the glories of America is how our culture has been enriched. And any of these fools who tell you that these immigration takes away jobs, but Mises would have been opposed to both. He would have been opposed to these conservative racist types. He would have been opposed to these state secessionist types. And like you say, it gets down to the individual, these freaky libertarian anarchist, individual sovereign types. Mises was not an anarchist. He was a
No,
classical
no,
liberal.
look, if someone wants to be an anarchist and make your arguments.
Yeah.
But don't take somebody else's name in the furtherance of
Huh.
your arguments.
One of the greatest writers and thinkers who ever lived, and corrupt what he said, contradict what he said, say things that would have offended him, and do it in his name. He's spinning in his grave, man. It's disgusting, and they should be ashamed of themselves.
Couldn't have said it better myself. All right, Jim, it has been a fabulous discussion once
Always,
again.
always.
Tell the people where they can find you.
I'm very active on Facebook. Almost every day I'm there answering questions about Ayn Rand or my book, Creating Christ, The Origins of Christianity. www.creatingchrist.com is our website. And I do a lot of work for the Ayn Rand Center, United Kingdom. Every week I'm doing multiple broadcasts for them, and I do special programs for them as well on the weekends. So you can always check out the Ayn Rand Center UK, folks. There's great stuff happening there. And if you want to just have a chat with me, I'm on X, I'm on Facebook. I'm on Facebook almost every day. Hook me up and we can have a chat.
Awesome. Thanks, Jim. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Remember, I want to see your likes. I want to hear your comments. It helps. Please comment, like. Thank you very much. Till next time.